Welcome, everyone, to another exciting class on Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. And tonight, what we're going to talk about is building the walls of Jerusalem. As we have already discussed, the building of the temple was actually not as once we started really working, we really decided to build, and poverty was overcome. um, it didn't seem to present that much of a problem from the surrounding nations or from the king or from the Persian emperor. However, that was not true of the walls of Jerusalem. And we already saw that when we were discussing building the temple in the book of Ezra, where the book of Ezra brings letters as if to show that there were royal objections to building a temple, when in fact those letters show that there were much later royal objections to building the walls of Jerusalem, of the city of Jerusalem. So tonight what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at that. And we're going to start actually with a different source, a source that isn't Nehemiah, for a change. When I talk about the walls of Jerusalem, we're going to be looking at Zechariah. What does Zechariah say about Jerusalem and what Jerusalem is going to be? So to remind you, Zechariah is speaking at the beginning of the beginning of the rule of Darius, right? He's prophesying in the second year of Darius. He's one of the Nevi'im, one of the prophets who urges the Jews to rebuild the temple. Let's take a look at see what he says about what about Jerusalem? What about the walls of Jerusalem? What is the promise regarding Jerusalem? And remember that Zechariah does speak in these kind of overflowing terms about what this return means, right? That there is going to be kind of a Davidic king and nations will be over. Like he does speak in somewhat flowery language. Let's take a look and see what he says. Okay, so I'm reading from Zechariah 2, and we're going right in the middle of a vision. I looked up and I saw, and I raised my eyes and I saw, and behold, there was a man, essentially an angel, and he's holding a measuring line, like a rope that's used to measure. V'omar, ana taholech. V'yomer elai lamot et Yerushalayim li'ot kama rochba v'kama orka. I said, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to measure Jerusalem. I'm going to see how wide and how long it is. The angel who spoke with me went out, and another angel came to meet him. Vayomer elav, roots the beryl and nar halaz lemor, prazote shev Yerushalayim merov adamu be'ema v'tocha. He says, run after that guy who's measuring Jerusalem. Run after him and tell him, no, you don't need to measure Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is going to dwell without walls. You're not going to need to measure its length and width. Why? Merov adam uvehema betocha, because it's going to have so many people and animals within it. Ve'ani ehye la ne'um Adonai chomat esh saviv u'lechavod ehye betocha. And I will be for her, for the city, God says, a wall of fire around it, and I will be a glory inside it. In other words, you can imagine what's going on, actually, right? You have people who have returned. You have the return to Zion. These are the returnees. And those people who have returned, they're looking around and they're saying, okay, we're going to build the temple. Jerusalem's in ruins. The wall, there are pieces of wall, but it's broken, it's burned. What about the walls of Jerusalem? And we already know, we've read letters from later, we know that it's not so easy building the walls of Jerusalem. And Zechariah says, no, you don't understand. Jerusalem doesn't need walls, because we'll have so many people and so many animals that it will dwell without walls. It's just going to overflow. And God will be the walls. God will be the walls of Jerusalem. Not only will God dwell in Jerusalem, God will be the walls of Jerusalem. Okay. And that's a beautiful vision. That's a beautiful vision. What's interesting is that we can see from the way Nehemiah talks about the walls of Jerusalem that this isn't, in fact, an idea that continues to be, let's say, popular among the returnees, probably because as time passes and they see that in fact there isn't a real messianic age, they're still dealing with all the regular issues of what it is to dwell in a difficult country, and Jerusalem is in ruins. What does it mean to return to Zion when there's no Zion, right? What does it mean to return to Zion when Zion is in ruins? So that's something that everyone is apparently dealing with. And now, how do I know they're apparently dealing with it? Because we can see from Nehemiah. Now, of course, when we read the book of Nehemiah, we are getting a specific point of view, right? And so it does not necessarily true that everyone looked at it this way. But let's take a look with the fact that Nehemiah is able, at least in the way it's told in the book of Nehemiah, as we'll see, Nehemiah is able to call on a tremendous amount of people helping and a tremendous amount of mesirut nefesh, of sacrifice from people in order to build the walls. And people are taking risks. They're risking their lives to build the walls of Jerusalem. And so we see how much this means to people. So before we go into Nehemiah, let's take a look at when it's happening. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look at our timeline. Okay. So here, where we are now is we're in Artaxerxes. So remember, in the second year of Darius, that's 521, 520, they returned to building the temple and they completed in the 6th year of Darius. That would be about 517, 516. We are now in 445. 445, the 20th year of Artaxerxes the first, is when Nehemiah receives permission to go to Jerusalem and build the wall. And that's what we're going to read now. So we've kind of jumped ahead in time, and yet we'll see that, again, the walls of Jerusalem are not built. We're going to go from the beginning of Nehemiah, because just to see how it portrays this idea that Jerusalem's not built. He says, these are the words of Nehemiah, the son of Chachaliah. Okay. It's in Kislev of the 20th year, and he is in Shushan, the fortress of Shushan, the capital. And it says, Vayavo Hanani echad me'achai huva Nashem Yehuda. So Hanani, one of my brothers, perhaps one of my colleagues, he and people from Judea, from Judah, and I asked about Hayudim hapleta asher nesharum and hashevi ve'al Yerushalayim. He asked two things. He asked about the Jews who returned from the exile, and he asked about Jerusalem. And so they say, well, neither is good. They say Vayomru li hanisharim asher nesharum and hashvi sham b'medina b'ra'a gdola u'becherpa. וחומת ירושלים מפרצת ושעריה ניצתו באש. On the one hand, the Jews are in a very bad way and living in shame and disgrace. And at the same time, the wall of Jerusalem has breaches and its gates have been burned with fire. Now, we know that's what the Babylonians did. That's what's described as what the Babylonians did. So it seems to be a continuing situation from the Babylonian exile. In other words, they haven't built the walls, and this is still the state of Jerusalem. And yet, when Nehemiah hears this, it says, "Vayhi kashom'i et hadvarim ha'ele yashafti ve'evke ve'et abla yamim ve'hi tzam u'mitpalel lifnei Elohei Hashemayim." And it was when I heard these things, I sat down and I cried and I mourned for days and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. And then we have the whole prayer that he prays. And then he comes to Artaxerxes. Now, he is the cupbearer of Artaxerxes. In other words, he's very high up in the court. He is the king's right-hand man. And in the month of Nisan, v'chodesh Nisan, shnat esrim l'Artaxerxes hamelech yayin lefanav, v'sat hayayin v'etna lamelech, v'lo hayiti ra lefanav. So it's Nisan on the 20th year of Artaxerxes, and there's wine before him, and he comes and he brings the wine to the king. And he had never been out of sorts in front of the king. It's a good idea not to be out of sorts in front of the king, as we shall see. And generally, the king is kind of expecting you to be cheery and supportive, but Nehemiah is not feeling it today. Vayomer li hamelech madua panecharaim, v'ata incha choleh. The king says, why is your face not good? Why do you look frowny, right? And you're not sick. This must be some kind of bad thought, something bad in your heart. And what does that mean? He's like, are you thinking of rebelling against me? Or do you have thoughts against me, the king? And that's why you're walking around like this. And Nehemiah says, and I was very scared, which is an appropriate response. Va'omar lamelech, hamelech le'olam yichya. He's like, no, may the king live forever. Madua lo yer'u panai asher ha'ir bet kivrot avotai chareva ushara ukluba esh. Why would I not seem sad when the city where my forefathers are buried is in ruins and its gates are consumed by fire? Vayomer li hamelech al mazat hamivakesh. And he says, the king says to him, so what are you asking for exactly? And I prayed to the God of heaven. Vomar lamelech, im lamelech tov. And and you hear the parallel to Esther. Esther is actually paralleling this, right? He said, it's good for the king. And if your servant is good before you, if I found favor before you, asher tishlacheni el Yehuda el ir kivrot avotai ve'evnena, that you should send me to Judah, to the city where my forefathers are buried, and I will build it. Vayomer li hamelech, vashegal yoshevet etzlo, ad matai yeh malachach u'matai tashuv. So the king says, okay, how long do you want to go for? And he tells him. And the king says, yes, you can go. And he sent him a set date. And then he asks for even more. Now, why is this? Why did he have to pray to God? He says, I prayed to God before telling him what I wanted. Why? To remind you, right? When we saw, switching now to Ezra 4, when we read the letters that were written between the surrounding nations and Artaxerxes about the walls of Jerusalem, where they advised the king, they said, this city is a rebellious city. It's harmful to kings and states. We advised the king that if the city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, you will no longer have any portion beyond the river. I'm reading now from Ezra 4. That was that letter that was brought. And the king said, right, you are correct. He says, in my order, a search has been made, and it has been found that this city has from the earliest times risen against kings, and that rebellion and sedition has been rife in it. And he goes on, and he says, now issue an order to stop these men. This city is not to be rebuilt until I so order. So this clearly seems to be an earlier order of Artaxerxes not to build the city. So for Nehemiah to actually get permission to build the city is a big deal, especially when the king is already suspecting him of maybe being a little rebellious. So he prays to God in his heart, one assumes, before he asks for this unbelievable favor. And he gets it. The king says, yes, you can go, you can be the governor of Judah, and you can rebuild the city walls. But I'm giving you a set time to return. And that giving him a set time to return actually makes it sound like he's even more in favor with the king. The king's like, yes, but I'm going to miss you. So you got to come back soon, right? How long are you going to go be away from me? You go do what you need to do and then come back to me, the king says. And it's like, that seems to say that not only is the king giving him what he asked for, he's still in favor with the king. And then he asks more. He asks for letters of passage, right? And a letter directing him to give me timber for roofing the gatehouses of the temple. He's asking for roofs for the gatehouses, not just of the temple, but also for the walls of the city. And the king gives them to him. In other words, he is able to not only get permission, but also get actually some financial support. Okay, so when Nehemiah comes, he's asked for these letters because he knows that he's going to need the king's okay, and to be able to show the king's okay, just to be able to go to Judea and do what he wants to do. So he goes to the governors of the whole district, and he gives them the letters of the king that have given this permission, save passage, and also permission, one assumes, to build the walls. I assume that's also in the letters. And the king sends with him bodyguards. He sends officers, Ufarashim. Vayishma Sanballat HaChoroni v'Tobiah ha'Eved ha'Amoni v'Yera lahem ra'a gdola asher ba Adam levakesh tova livnei Israel. And these are going to be his big enemies, Sanballat of Choron, and Tobiah, who's an Ammonite servant or possibly slave in the past. And they really don't like that he's come to do good for the children of Israel. And in fact, what he does, and he knows that he's in danger, he gets up at night and he tours the walls. He doesn't go out in the day. At night, in secret, telling no one, right? He tells no one. Akum Laila, I got up at night. right? Aniva nashim me'at imi, me and a few people with me. V'lo higati la'adam, I didn't tell anyone. Ma Eloheinu tenali be what my God told me, essentially gave me idea to do. Lasot Yerushalayim, to do for Jerusalem. And he didn't have any animals except for the ones that he was writing. In other words, he does it in secret, and he essentially tours the walls of Jerusalem. And it describes what he goes around. I'm doing this quickly because we have a lot to cover tonight. No one knows what he's done. He didn't even tell other Jews. No one knows. And then he says to them, V'omar lehem, atem ro'im hara'a asher nachnu ba, asher Yerushalayim kareva, u'sha'areh nitztu ba'esh, lechu v'nivnet chomat Yerushalayim, v'lo niyeh od cherpa. Says, you see this tremendous evil state that we're in, that Jerusalem is in ruins, and that her gates have been consumed by fire. Let us go and build the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. In other words, this is a disgraceful situation for, and I do think he's thinking in terms of the nation of Israel. Remember, he said one of the things that his enemies don't like is that he's come to do good. Let's go back for just a moment. That he's come to do good, livnei Israel, for the children of Israel. We as a nation, it is shameful for us not to have our city built. Our city is in ruins. We are living in disgrace. V'gid lahem et yad Elohai asher hi tova alai. V'af divrei hamelech asher amar li, v'yomru nakum uvaninu v'chasku yedehem latova. So he tells the other Jews who had not told when he was touring, but now he's telling everyone, saying, he says, I explained to them that God is with me, and that what the king said, in other words, what does he need to do to convince them that now we can do it? He says, look, God is with me to the extent that the king gave me permission to do this, and I'm still in favor with the king. That's how much God is with me, and God is with us to do this. And this is what gave them encouragement to, in fact, build the walls. And they're going to really need that encouragement because it's going to be really hard. What's the first thing that the enemies do? The first thing they do is mock them. Okay, they think this is the way they're going to stop them building. We knew have a new. So when Sanballat of Horon and Tovia, the Ammonite servant or slave, and Geshem, the Arab, heard, they mocked us, right? And they said, "What is this thing you're going to do? Are you rebelling against the king?" And remember the letter. The letter said, "This city is rebellious," right? That's the whole argument about why they shouldn't be allowed to build the city, is that they'll build the city and rebel. This is a rebellious city. If you build the city, you're going to rebel. So that's what they're hinting. They're hinting, oh, are you going to build the city now? Are you going to rebel? In other words, we're going to create problems for you because this looks like rebellious behavior. Vashiv otam davar, v'amar lahem Elohei Hashemayim hu yatzliach lanu, v'anachnu avadav nakum ubaninu, v'lachem en chelek utztakav v'zikaron b'Yerushalayim. And I told him, I said, the God of heaven is the one who will make us successful in this. He will help us with this. And we, his servants, will build and establish, and you will have no share in or hold in Jerusalem. And then, in fact, everyone kind of gets together, and we'll see later the building of the walls does not seem to take a lot of time once they actually get it done. But we'll see also that they have to do it quickly because they're under threat. He goes into everyone who essentially helped build it, the different families, built different parts of the walls, et cetera, and repaired different parts of the gate. I'm not going into all the different details. It's essentially a list.
Miriam?
Yes.
The people who are causing trouble now, are they supposed to be the same people who caused trouble when they came to build the temple?
It depends on how you read the passage in Ezra. Why? Because if you say in the passage of Ezra, the people who wanted to build the temple with us were the same people causing trouble, then no, it's not the same people. Because these guys are not interested in building the temple. They are not related. Maybe they believe it's their God, but he's specifically naming where they're from. This one's from Corona, this one is Ammonite, and this one's an Arab. They're not from the Jews, and they're not from those people in the Shomron who are worshiping our God, right? That's not the issue. It's a power battle, and they have different ethnic identities. Okay, very, very clearly. So it doesn't seem to be that they're the same people who wanted to build the temple with the returning Judeans in Ezra. You could say, however, you can also read Ezra to say there were the people who wanted to build the temple, then there were the surrounding nations that made problems. They could absolutely be the surrounding nations making problems. Okay, so that's it depends how you read that passage in Ezra. Okay, so let's continue. And now we start hearing about Shomronim. All right, now we start hearing about Shomronim. Before, remember, they were not called the Shomronim. What we heard before in Ezra was people who said, we have been worshiping your God since we were placed here by the Assyrians. They don't say we're Shomronim, but now we are going to start hearing about Shomronim. ויהי כאשר שמע סנבלט, כי אנחנו בונים את החומה, ויחר לו, ויכעס הרבה, וילעג על היהודים. So when Sanballat heard they were building the wall, he got very angry, and he started to mock the Jews. ויאמר לפני אחיו בחיל שומרון, ויאמר מה היהודים המללים עושים, היעזבו להם, היזבחו, היכלו ביום, היחיו את האבנים מערמות העפר בהמה שרופות. They said, what are these miserable Jews doing? Are they going to restore these? Are they going to sacrifice? Are they going to finish this in a day? Will they bring these stones back to life from the heaps of dust? For they are burnt. Now, this is not just making a statement about building a wall, right? It's very clearly saying what you lost, you're never getting back. Are you going to restore something that was destroyed and burnt? No, it's not going to happen. And so we're starting to kind of see the symbolism of the city for everyone. Everyone is kind of seeing this. Can you restore the city? Can you restore what you lost? No, you will never restore it, right? Because it's been burned. It's dead. It's in piles of dirt. And we're going to see that, of course, the idea is that, yes, absolutely, we can rebuild it. It's also a weird thing to say. That's how it's so clearly metaphorical, because, of course, sure, why can't we rebuild? I mean, they're burned, so what? I mean, big deal. But that it's clearly kind of metaphorical that you can't rebuild what you lost.
Miriam?
Yes?
Weren't they already doing the sacrifices? They already had the temple.
That's weird. Maybe it means that will they sacrifice to God for him to help them? Right? In other words, because you would sacrifice to God in order to build the wall. וטוביה המוני אצלו, ויאמר, גם אשר הם בונים, אם יעלה שועל לפרץ חומת אבניהם. And Tovia Amoni, for the Ammonite, says, even if they're building, a fox could get through this wall that they're going to build, right? And Zechariah says, Shema Eloheinu ki ayinu vuza v'Hashem charpatam el rosham utnem leviza be'eretz yeshivia. So here's this interpolation of, oh, hear God, how we've become a laughing stock, and return their shame on their heads, and may they be a laughing stock in a land of captivity. Right? They'll have to pay for this sin that they are angering the builders. And they go back, they built the wall to half its height, and the nation's heart was in the work. They're like, yay, we are doing it. Okay, so now the neighbors get serious about stopping this. ויהי כאשר שמע סנבלט וטוביה והערבים והמונים באשדודים, כי עלתה ערוכה לחומות ירושלים, כי החלו הפרוצים להיסתם ואיחר להם מאוד. So when, who hears? Sanballat and Tovia and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, right? Essentially the Plishtim, right? Who have come back to Ashdod, they all hear that in fact, the walls of Jerusalem are being healed. They're going up. And the breaches are being filled. They get very angry. Now, again, here we see how political this is. This is considered something that is an affront to the surrounding nations. The fact that the Jews, the Judeans, are rebuilding their city is an affront, perhaps a threat. Everyone around is very upset, and it's very clear that here we're talking about different nations around, different ethnicities around. ויקשו כולם יחדיו לבוא להילחם בירושלים ולעשות לו תורה. So what's their next step? They tried mocking. That didn't work. Now they're going to fight. They are all going to get together and fight against Jerusalem and create problems. ונתפלל אלוהינו ונעמיד משמר עליהם יומם ולילה מפניהם. So we prayed to God and we set up a watch, right? Day and night against them. ויאמר יהודה כשל כוח הסבל ועפר הרבה ואנחנו לא נוכל לבנות בחומה. At this point, this is when the Jews start to say, maybe we can't do this, right? Because there's an army. The danger is that there's an army that's going to come. How can we do this? How can we build this wall? And they say a kind of a poem, right? Kashal koach hasabal v'afar harbe, right? The basket carrier's strength has waned and the dust is great. The dirt is great, right? And we are not going to be able to build the wall. Vayomru, Tsarenu lo yed'u v'lo yir'u ad asher navo el tocham v'haragnu v'shbatnu et hamalacha. So Vayimru Tsarenu, I should say, Vayimru Tsarenu, and our enemies said, they won't know, they won't even see until we're among them and we'll kill them and we'll stop the work. They're going to attack and kill them just to stop them from building the walls. Okay. Vayhi kasher ba'u haYehudim hayoshvim etzlam ve'emru lanu eser pamim mikol makomot asher tashuvu aleinu. You can see it's not clear. And it was when the Jews who were dwelling among them, they would come and tell us these things over and over from all the places they were returning. In other words, how do we know they were planning this? Because there were Jews who lived among them. And they would come and they would tell us what was going on. So what does he do? Va'amid mitachtiot lamakom me'acharei lachoma batzchichim va'amid et ha'am lemishpachot im charbotehem rokehem v'kashtotehem. He sets up people behind the wall in the cracks, and they stand according to their families. In other words, how do you know every family has representatives? They're standing there with swords and spears and bows. Bows as in bows and arrows. Ve'erev v'akum v'omar el achorim v'askanim v'yeter ha'am al tir'u mepneihem et Adonai hagadol v'nora zechoru v'lachamu al achechem b'neichem u'bnotechem d'shechem u'batechem. So he does two things. Nehemiah is like kind of the classic good leader, right? First, he arms everyone. He says, okay, he arms them, he stations people. And then he actually has to motivate them. He gets up and he says in front of all of the nobles, but also in front of everyone, do not fear them. Remember our great and awesome God and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. ויהי כאשר שמעו אויבינו כי נודע לנו ויפר אלוהים את עצתם ונשב כולנו אל החומה איש על מלאכתו. So our enemies realized that we found out their plot, and then we were all able to continue building. However, ויהי מן היום ההוא חצי נערי עושים במלאכה וחציים מחזיקים הרמחים והמגינים. So he has his people, Nehemiah, half of them are working on the wall, and half of them are standing with weapons. They're all with spears, they're with shields, they're with bows, they're with armor. The officers stood behind all of the house of Judah. Everyone who was rebuilding the wall, right? One hand is doing the work, right? And the other hand holds a weapon. So no one just built anymore. Everyone's got half an eye open in case they get attacked. והבונים איש חרבו אסורים על מתניו ובונים ותוקע בשופר אצלי. The builders, each person had a sword fastened at his side, right? And they would build. So you have builders armed with swords. The person who was going to trumpet stood with me. In other words, what does that mean? There was someone guarding, always on watch. What does the trumpeter mean? What does the person tokea b'shofar? Why is he there? He's there to warn them that soldiers are coming. So in other words, the entire time, everyone's got weapons. There's someone on guard the entire time to see if there's an army coming to stop them from building the wall. Really, they're building, they're not soldiers. but they have to be on guard from an army. And he says to them, he's being very practical. He says, listen, guys, it's a big wall. We're all spread out. As soon as you hear the sound of the shofar, I want you to gather to us. Eloheinu yilchem lanu. God will fight for us. Right? We're all going to gather with our weapons, and God will fight for us. Yeah, but we're all gathering. We have our weapons, but that's the two-sided thing, and that's how we continued working. We worked from dawn until night, until the stars came out. So in other words, they were working very, very full days. Why? Because they want to finish it as quickly as possible. Because this is a very difficult situation that they have, and they have to finish it as quickly as possible. גם בעת ההיא אמרתי לעם, איש ונערו ילינו בתוך ירושלים, ויהיו לנו הלילה משמר והיום מלאכה. So let everyone stay with his servants in Jerusalem so that at night we can stand guard and we can work during the day. In other words, we can't leave the city walls because as soon as we leave them, someone's going to come and try to attack the walls and take down the walls. We have to guard the walls even at night. Okay? And ואין אני ואחי ונערי ואנשי המשמר אשר אחרי, אין אנחנו פושטים בגדינו, איש שלך המים. And I and my colleagues, the people who were with me, and my entourage, and the people who were on guard, we didn't even take our clothes off at night because they had to be ready to defend the walls. And ish shel kol hamayim seems to be shortened. It probably means even if we went to get water, we had to be with our weapons. So that was what was building the wall, right? That was what building the wall meant. And what we see is that why do we go into all this detail in terms of just how difficult it was? Well, I mean, first of all, it's important, right? Because you can see kind of how the fact that it was difficult shows how meaningful it was, frankly. The fact that, because we say, oh, why did they care? Or was it just Nehemiah who cared? Clearly, it was not just Nehemiah who cared. You've got everyone armed, putting their lives in danger to build the wall around Jerusalem. Building Jerusalem was tremendously meaningful. Yes.
Could it possibly be that going to the water is a euphemism for going to
Could be going to the bathroom. It could be. It could be that going to the water is going to the bathroom. I thought that too. I haven't seen that proposed as a way to fill in the verse, right? But to me, I also would think that's what makes sense, right? Especially in a situation like that. You don't want to get caught with your pants down, as it were. So after we've seen kind of that everyone has been part of building the wall, and we've already seen this because of the symbolism of what it means to build Jerusalem. Building Jerusalem really is a big part of rebuilding the nation from the point of view of the people living there. You have to rebuild the city, and they haven't been rebuilding the city. It means living in shame. It means living with the memory of captivity alive within you because your city, your capital lies in ruins and as a burnt husk of what it should be. And so it's so important to rebuild. And that is central to rebuilding the nation. And I do believe that this is how these Jews are seeing it, that this is central to the whole project of what we would think about as the return to Zion. So let's continue. We're going to jump ahead to Nehemiah 6, Nehemiah Vav. ויהי כאשר נשמע לסנבלט וטוביה ולגשם הערבי וליתר אויבינו, כי בניתי את החומה, ולא נותר בה פרץ, גם עד העת ההיא, דלתות לא עמדתי בשערים. So they built the walls, they filled in all the gaps, but the gates aren't up yet. And so Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem all hear about this. וישלח סנבלט וגשם אלי לאמור לך ונוועדה יחדיו בכפירים בבקעת אונו, והם החושבים לעשות לי רעה. Now Nehemiah is personally being threatened. There's an assassination plot against Nehemiah. Sanballat and Geshem, they say, hey, let's meet together. But they're actually he says they're planning to do me some kind of harm. And how he knows is probably also from these people who are kind of among them, Jews who are among them and who are telling him this. I'm really busy. He says, I'm way too busy. I cannot possibly meet you there. I can't come down. Virati alechem. Why would I have the work stop when I leave it to come down to you? And they said 4 times, and I gave them the same answer, right? And then Sanballat says the same message a 5th time, and he sends another letter. He sends Igeret Ptucha, an unsealed letter. כתוב בה, בגויים נשמע וגשמו אומר, אתה והיהודים חושבים למרוד, על כן אתה בונה החומה, ואתה הובל להם למלך כדברים האלה. And he says, we have heard among the nations, and Geshem also says this, that you and the Jews are planning on rebelling, and that's why you're building the wall. And you're going to be their king. And the prophets, you have set up prophets to call you a king in Yehudah. And now the king's going to hear these things. Listen, we are going to tell the king that we have heard that you're all going to rebel. And not only are you all going to rebel, but you, Nehemiah, have set it up that you're going to be a king. And so you are a rebel, you are a traitor, and now you're going to be killed by the king because you're leading rebellion. He's like, no, you're lying. You're making the whole thing up. He's got nerve. He's got nerve. He's like, nah, you're making it up. Everyone can see you're making it up. You're just lying. You're not scaring me. And he's saying everyone was trying to scare us, but now essentially God strengthened my hands. And then he goes to visit Shemaiah, and he says, let's go to the Beit HaMikdash and shut the doors because they're going to come to kill you. And if you hide in the Beit HaMikdash, maybe you'll be safe. And he says, V'amra, ha'ish kamoni yivrach, umi kamoni asher yavo el heichal v'chai lo avo. Says, no, what are you killing me? I'm not going. Someone like me, I'm going to go into the temple precinct and hide there. It's not treating the temple correctly. It's me not being courageous enough. No way. All right. And he says, Vakira vine lo Elohim shlacho ki hanevuah diber elai Tobiah v'Sanballat scharo. And he says, no, he tried to say a prophecy, but it wasn't a prophecy at all. He was hired. He was bribed by Tobiah and Sanballat. Leman sachorhu, leman ira v'seh kain v'chatati, v'yalachem l'shem ra, leman yicharfuni. Right? So in other words, they paid off this prophet to give me a fake prophecy that says I should hide in the temple so that would discredit me. That's how paranoid Nehemiah has to be, right? And in fact, the wall is finished on the 25th of Elul, after 52 days. So we've had people threatening the builders and then actual first shaming them and then threatening them with an army and then trying to assassinate Nehemiah himself and trying to discredit him. None of this worked, and the wall is finished after 52 days on the 25th of Elul. Right? Right? When our enemies heard and all the nations around us saw, they felt very low in their own eyes because they knew that it was from God that this work was done. And this is super important because this is the idea that we couldn't have done it without God. With all these threats, why is it important to mention all these threats? To say God was with us when we built the wall. Because otherwise, there's no way we could have done it. There's no way that I could have had the guts and that that we could have finished, that we would have prevailed, et cetera, with all these threats if God weren't with us, and everyone understands that. And thus, the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem become what was expected. In other words, a piece of saying we are back, we are rebuilding, and this is what God wanted. This is what God promised. Now, remember that in Ezra and Nehemiah, that's how this is presented. What God promised Yirmiyahu, what God promised Jeremiah is this return to Zion. It's fine to be part of the Persian Empire in a semi-autonomous region with a Jewish leader who is not a king, but with a temple that's built, with the Torah that's being read, all these different pieces. This is what it means to rebuild as a Jewish nation. And this is what was promised, as opposed to in some of the prophecies where what's promised is much bigger, is much more either apocalyptic or it's going to be rattling all the nations of the world. No, this is what God promised. But for us to have what God promised, we have to have a city. We have to be proud as a nation and have our city, Zion, built. We have to build it, and we can't let anything stop us. And in fact, that he continues that saying that it's not the end, all the problems that he has with Tovia. Tovia has, in fact, intermarried with different important families of Yehuda. And so there's a constant afterward political battle between him and Tovia. And he says he's still sending letters to intimidate me. But the walls rebuilt. They set up the doors. And in fact, let's skip ahead. And everyone, and skip ahead. Actually, let's skip ahead now to Nehemiah Yud Aleph, Nehemiah 11. As I mentioned before, I'm just showing you this quickly inside. After the walls are built, the city's almost only half settled, because a city that's in ruins with ruined walls, people aren't just filling the city. They're not living everywhere. So what they do is they actually cast lots. Hipilu goralot. They cast lots. They actually say a tenth of all the people need to settle in Jerusalem, and everyone else can be in the other cities. Okay. And the nation blessed anyone who volunteered to live in the city of Jerusalem, because the city of Jerusalem is still kind of in ruins. They have to rebuild the houses. So they say, good for you. Way to go that you volunteered to live in Jerusalem. Okay. And then he goes through who was living in Jerusalem. And when they finished the wall, here we are. And then they dedicate the wall. And this is one of the places, remember where I said where in general Nehemiah and Ezra actually seem to function completely separately in the book. They don't seem to overlap. This is one of the exceptions where it's specifically naming them together. Right? This is in the days of Yoakim, son of Yoshua, son of Yotzadak, right? So it's the next generation after Yoshua ben Yotzadak, the Kohen Gadol, and the time of Nehemiah, the Pecha, and Ezra Kohen Sofer. So here's Ezra and Nehemiah put together. And we have the dedication of the wall. This is the tremendous kind of party that I would have expected when the temple was finished, at least to be described when the temple was finished. There's a much longer description here of what happened at the dedication of the wall than of what happened in the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash of the temple when it was finished, not when it was started, right? So here at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites, wherever they lived, were sought out and brought to Jerusalem to celebrate a joyful dedication with thanksgiving and with song, accompanied by cymbals, mitzel taim, nivalim u'bechilot, harps and lyres. And then you have the singers. Mishorarim, by the way, you have different classes. In Shivat Zion, the Return to Zion, there are Levites, and then there are Mishorarim, singers, that seem to be a separate class, right? So all the people of the Mishorarim class, the companies of singers, they also come from all around Jerusalem, okay? And they all gather to Jerusalem for this dedication of the walls. They purified the priests, and the Levites were purified, the people were purified, and they purified the gates and the wall. So the wall itself is being purified, it's being dedicated, it's really being dedicated like the temple. And all of the nobles of Yehuda go up on the wall. The officers of Yehuda, they go up on the wall, and there are two Thanksgiving choirs. They march south on the wall towards the Dung Gate. You have all these different people who are part of this procession. Clearly, these are people that we're supposed to recognize, right? And they're all B'chlei Shir David Ish Elohim, with the same instruments as David, the man of God, right? And here we have again Ezra. Ezra Sofer Levehem, and Ezra Sofer is in front of them. And they go all around the gates. And then you have in the opposite direction, another Thanksgiving choir going. So you have a whole procession going in two directions on the walls. And where do they stop? So both choirs end, they go from opposite sides, and they end at the temple, right? And all of the priests are there with trumpets, and the singers are there, and when they all brought sacrifices and rejoiced, Ki Elohim simcham simcha gdola, v'gam hanashim v'yaladim samechu, v'tishama simchat Yerushalayim merachok. Because God gave them this very great joy, and the women, the children also rejoiced, and you could hear the rejoicing of Jerusalem from afar. And then they have everyone who's appointed over the different chambers, the different treasuries, who's going to be responsible for bringing the first fruits, the tithes, all sorts of different things that are required for the temple. And also different singers. There's also an idea here that things in the temple were not really being run correctly until Nehemiah kind of comes and makes things work, because realize the singers are supposed to they also have a job in the temple, but they've been in the surrounding cities, and here they're being brought in. So there seems to be also, this is going to help the correct running of the temple. This reflects something specific in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah as a whole. Let's read this. And all of Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave portions to the singers and the gatekeepers every day. And they made sacred contributions to the Leviim, to the Levites, and the Levites gave contributions to Bnei Aaron, to the priests. What is it saying? Remember, Ezra and Nehemiah essentially wants to present it as if there are two main generations. There's Zerubbabel and Yehoshua, and there's Nehemiah and Ezra. Okay, now we know we have the chronology. It's not quite that way, but the way the book wants to present it is, this is the way it is. But these are the correct generations. Zerubbabel did things right, Nehemiah did things right. Zerubbabel was Pecha, Nehemiah was Pecha. So in the time of Zerubbabel and in the time of Nehemiah, all of Israel contributed the daily portions of the singers and the gatekeepers and the Levites. In other words, everyone who has jobs in the temple and in Jerusalem, and to keep Jerusalem, they are being taken care of. They're being provided for. This is an important theme also in the book of Nehemiah, to make sure that everyone is actually getting their due, which becomes an issue later on in Nehemiah's governorship. So what we've seen is that what we normally don't even think about when we think about the return to Zion. And I don't mean for the people who, live and breathe the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm talking about most of us, when we think about the return to Zion, we think about rebuilding the temple. And when we read the book, we see that the big deal in Nehemiah is building the wall. And actually building the wall has a lot more ink spilled on it than rebuilding the temple. Because rebuilding the temple, once they get their act together, is actually relatively straightforward, whereas rebuilding the wall is not. And yet, everyone comes together for it. Everyone sacrifices for it. It is so important. And it's interesting to think about why it is, because it's something that is a little bit surprising when we read it. We're like, why did it matter that much? And it is a part of it is truly symbolic, because the fact is they don't then rebel. This isn't meant to be a fortress. It's meant to be the city. It's meant to be Zion. It's meant to be the city to which we wanted to return. And we must rebuild it, otherwise we live in shame. And it says something not only to the Jews, not only to Bnei Israel, and as such, it says something to the surrounding nations. And as a symbol, it's a symbol that the surrounding nations also understand. So Susan here says, what a contrast this joy is to the crying of those who compares the new temple to the old. Yes, I think it is actually really refreshing to read about this rejoicing of the wall after we had that kind of the crying, the mix of the crying and the joy in the beginning of the building of the temple. And then I would have liked to read more of the joy when the temple's finished, but it's not. Even though there is joy, it's not dwelt on. Here, we really do have this idea of everyone is simply joyful. Everyone is simply happy. And of all classes, all the types of people and women and children, everyone is rejoicing, and you can hear it from afar. And it is an interesting contrast to the way that the beginning of the rebuilding of the temple was portrayed. So thank you for joining me. I hope that for at least some of you, this opened some new vistas in terms of what it was like to return and rebuild. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Take care, everyone.